Hey there, Drew here, and welcome back to the Drew Saur coaching channel. If this is your first time here, thanks for joining us. This channel is for those of us who want to have stellar careers with a little less stress, and if we can, a bit more fun. My job is to bring you ideas that'll help you look at your career in a new way. I promise that if you try them out, you'll start to see the professional world differently. And more importantly, they'll start to see you differently. So this video is part of my series on persuasive storytelling, because to get anything done in our careers, we need other people. So the question we're trying to answer here is, can I get others to join me? And this video is the third in my series on interview tips. Because ultimately, interviewing is all about storytelling, convincing people of your value in a very short amount of time. But what I want to talk about today is the problem with one of the sort of most common models that people use when they prepare for an interview, namely the STAR model, as well as introduce a new model that I've developed working with my clients, which will help you give you a much more effective way to communicate your value. So let's start with the STAR model. If you're not familiar with the STAR model, it's an acronym. It stands for situation, task, action, and result. And it's a very solid, very good structure, particularly if you didn't know what you were doing before and you just kind of talked. Giving yourself a structure is obviously a good idea. And it becomes very common in a behavioral interview type scenario. So let me give you an example of what happens. So, a common question. Can you tell me about a time you had a difficult relationship with a coworker or at work and what you did to resolve it? Okay, pretty standard. So then what happens is you start. You say the situation. Well, there was this time we were working on this project and our client, we had a bad relationship with our client. Okay, you then talk about the task. Well, the task is kind of obvious, it's repair the relationship. You talk about what you did, the action, and then ultimately you get to the result, which typically comes across as, and now we're best friends and everything's good. Okay? There's a couple problems with this approach. One is that you got to remember that the person doing the interview does this all the time. They've listened to dozens of people and possibly hundreds for the candidacy for this role. And they've listened to most stories. And most stories just aren't that interesting. So you tell a story, and if it takes you 5 or 10 minutes, you don't get to the important part. What's the important part? The result, right? So I tell you the story about how I did all this stuff, and I did this, I did that. As an interviewer, I don't even know if I really care about this story yet, because half the stories I hear are just boring and don't really add much to it. So I'm waiting until the end, and if it goes on too long, you've just lost my attention. So you have no sense of whether the result is important enough to add value to the interview. And that's why I'm not a big fan of the STAR models, because the most important thing you leave to the end. And if you lost somebody before you got to the end, you just wasted 10 minutes, right? And these interviews, half hour, maybe a couple hours if you're doing a whole bunch of them, losing that kind of time is a very bad thing. So what's a better way to do this? So what I advise my clients on, and this is a new sort of term for this model, so I'd love your feedback, whether you like it, but I call it the VSD model. It's value first, keep it short, detail on demand. So let's talk about the same scenario. Can you tell me about a time where you had a difficult relationship with somebody you work with, and what did you do about it? So same exact situation, but now I'm thinking the value. What is my best value story? So I say something like, of course, I'd love to talk about that. Let me tell you about the time we had a client who had significant relationship issues with our company. I was brought in, and within 3 months, we turned it around and I sold $5 million worth of new work. Okay, now I told you what the result was in a value-centric way. I told you that basically I managed to turn this around and sell $5 million worth of new work. Now I have your attention. That's a lot. That's pretty good. Okay, keep it short. So what did you do? Figure out your message. Ultimately, it was all about trust, right? We've had previous sort of engagement managers who were in there. They really didn't meet their deliverables, and my focus was on building trust with my client. What did I do? I understood what their goals are. I spent a lot of time talking to their peers to figure out what was important to them, and then I delivered. And I delivered that consistently over 3 months, and I have to tell you, at the end of 3 months, he said, you know what? You're the first person from your company, from my company, that I trust, right? All these other people always told me promises, but we never got the value. You're the first person who really delivered what they asked for. And from that moment, he's been a great client, and as I said, deals started coming in and we sold $5 million in 3 months. Right, that was a 30-second version. So that's the keep it short. Executive summary, right? I have a lot of other videos on that. Keep it short. And here's the key, detail on demand. So that was what I did, that was the result. I'm happy to talk about the specifics of how I did that if it's of interest to you. And you give the option to the interviewer. Because one of two things will happen. One, they got what they needed, right? So they said, nope, that's great, thank you, that's a great story, I really appreciate it. Let's move on to this other thing I need to ask you about. So you provided value, you didn't take a lot of time in the interview, and now you can move on to providing other value stories. Or two, they'll start to dig into that, and you'll get some information about what's going on in your target company. So they'll say, actually, that's great. Can you talk to me? How did you figure out what the underlying problem was, what their goals were? Because we've had very similar situations. We have a couple of really tough clients, and I'd love to hear, how did you do that? And now you know very specifically what do they want to know about that value story. They don't really care about the beginning. They don't care about the end. What they want to care about is, well, how did you figure out what was the thing that mattered to your client? What were the techniques you used? What was the tactics you did? Because they're very interested in that very specific thing. And now you know how to basically tell that side of the story. And here's the trick, then you repeat, right? So you say, okay, so in terms of understanding, it's all about listening, right? We know this, but it's obviously hard to do. So all I did was for 3 weeks straight, I went into his office and I just asked questions. I asked questions and I recapped. And at the end of the 3 weeks, I came back to him and I said, okay, based on all the input, and I thank you for your time, here's what I think the real issue here. Am I correct? Right? And once again, I can talk about the techniques I used. I do have a little bit of background in psychology. I can talk about how I asked those questions, but fundamentally that was it. It was about taking the time to listen and recap his problems. Once again, the value was, okay, how did you figure out the problems? Because that was what contributed to the sales. I gave you a short version of what I did, some of the techniques I used, and then I asked you again if you want more detail. So that's it. Value first, keep it short, detail on demand. Only give the detail if they ask for it. So that's the new model. Again, I'd love feedback in terms of whether that makes sense and whether that's useful for you. But what happens if you don't do this, right? If you don't focus on the value, you're just another candidate telling another story. And as somebody who's done hundreds of interviews in my careers, it gets a bit boring, just to be honest, right? You don't want to be a good candidate because there are hundreds of good candidates. What you want to be is an amazing candidate. An amazing candidate understands the value that's trying to be accomplished in the job and can provide that value to them in the interview in a very short amount of time, getting to the things that are important, and once again, responding to detail on demand, the things that are important to the interviewer. So what's the exercise? Try it out. If you're in the interview process, rethink your stories. Value first. What is the first thing you're going to say? And the first thing you're going to say is about the value you delivered at the end of the scenario that you're about to describe. Right? So value first, then keep it short. Come up with the executive summary version and time yourself. I guarantee you talk for longer than you think you do. Right? People, and I've talked to many people, so this is provable. Right? You think it took you 2 minutes to sell that story, it was 7. Right? It always takes longer than you think it does. So practice keeping it short. Learn what 30 seconds actually feels like, because it's a really short amount of time. So learn what that feels like so you can answer in a quick and succinct way. And then detail on demand. Work on your questions. Have the questions. What are you going to ask at the end of it? Right? How are you going to vary that so it doesn't get boring throughout the interview? So that's the exercise. Try it out. I'd love to hear how it goes. And as always, when you are making a career change, when you're trying to grow to that next level, it helps to have a partner. You can hire a coach, you can rope in a friend, and if you have any interest in working with me, feel free to go to drewsaur.com. We can schedule some time to chat. I look forward to seeing you next time.